All right, night owls, buckle your bathrobes. Tonight we're teleporting to a place so far off the grid even your Wi-Fi sighs and gives up. I'm talking no Starbucks within 300 miles levels of wilderness, where the local wildlife considers protein bars a hate crime. Most of you would last 45 minutes, tops. Half of you would call an Uber that instantly explodes from loneliness. Survival rating. 1 star on a 5-star scale, and that star is actually just a plane's emergency flare politely waving goodbye. Before you settle in and spill ramen on the blanket fort, do the digital high five. Smash like, obliterate subscribe, only if my voice hasn't already voided your warranty. Drop your coordinates in the chat so I can judge your time zone like a jealous vampire. 3 p.m. in sunny Cali. Cute. I'm recording this at the hour when even the moon needs coffee. Now, ambience checklist. Lights dimmer than your ex's future. Fan on low so it sounds like distant helicopter rescue you'll never get. And yes, pants optional but dignity strongly discouraged. We're about to tiptoe into a landscape where every twig snap is nature's jump scare, and your smartwatch just texts lol good luck. So wrap yourself in that questionable blanket, tell your roommates you're researching, and let's tiptoe into the absurd. By sunrise, you'll either emerge a legend or a cautionary tale retold by squirrels. Either way, hit play, hug your water bottle like it's the last witness, and let's casually stroll into the kind of night that refunds your bravery in nightmares. Ready? 3, 2, vanish. High in the thin air of the eastern Andes, where clouds coil around knife-edge ridges and the sun strikes the horizon like a bronze gong, a modest shrub with pale green elliptical leaves has stood sentinel for at least 8 millennia. Botanists call it Erythroxylum Coca, but to the people who first named these mountains, the plant was simply Mama, the mother who numbs hunger, cold, and sorrow. Here, at 10,000 feet above the grinding Pacific plates, the earliest hunters of deer and guanaco discovered that a mouthful of alkaline lime and a wad of coca could hush the ache in their lungs and turn the bitter wind into a tolerable companion. Charred coca leaves, radiocarbon dated to 6000 BCE, lie side by side with spear points at the cave of Nanchok in northern Peru. Silent witnesses that the partnership between human beings and this alkaloid-rich foliage predates pottery, maize, and the first stone courses of the pyramids of Egypt. Centuries drifted like snow on the Cordillera. By 2500 BCE, agrarian villages on the western slopes had begun cultivating coca in small, irrigated terraces, trading dried leaf down to the coastal fisheries in exchange for anchovy meal and cotton. The plant's prestige grew with distance. The farther it traveled from the highlands, the more mythic it became. Carvings from the Cupasneak culture show shamans with cheek bulging coca quids, their eyes half-lidded in trance, communing with feline spirits that guard the underworld. Across the watershed, in the Titicaca Basin, priests of the Kairipa culture burned coca as incense, the rising smoke a ladder upon which the souls of the dead might climb back to the constellation of the Llama. Wherever it burned, coca was never mere vegetation. It was currency, liturgy, medicine, and passport to the divine. Time's current quickened. Between 1200 and 400 BCE, the Chavin horizon unfurled across the central Andes, a religious revolution carved in stone and narcotic reverie. Pilgrims climbed to the temple complex of Chavin de Huanta, where granite jaguars snarl above subterranean passageways. In the torch-lit galleries, priests dispensed coca and lime to petitioners who emerged trembling, hearts racing from the sudden bloom of cocaine in their blood, convinced they had heard the jaguar guard roar inside their own ribs. The state had discovered what plant chemists would not prove for another 3 millennia, an alkaloid that could fuse awe, obedience, and euphoria into a single indelible moment. Far to the south, on the parched coastline of the Nazca valleys, the leaf accompanied an even stranger rite. Here, between 100 BCE and 800 CE, shamans snipped coca into the wounds of ritual head trepanation, the local anesthetic allowing surgeons to cut neat rectangles of living skull while patients remained conscious, singing. Trophy heads preserved with coca paste in their mouths still stare at us from museum cabinets, their lips stitched shut with cactus spines, embalmed screams replaced by the green ambassador that had accompanied them across the threshold. As empires rose and collapsed like lungs, coca remained the constant breath between them. The March warlords of the northern coast packed coca leaves alongside the mummified cadavers of their kings, ensuring that even in the afterlife, the royal palate could taste the cold sparkle of the Cordillera. The wary, first to knit the fractured Andes into an empire of roads and storehouses, institutionalized coca as state stipend. Every corvée laborer on the royal highways received a daily ration, precise, weighed, and stamped with the bureaucratic seal of the administrator who governed the leaf. Thus, centuries before the first Inca hurled his spear toward Cuzco, cocaine, though still bound in chlorophyll, had already become the oil that lubricated taxation, diplomacy, and war. Then came the Inca, the self-styled children of the sun, who did not invent coca but who elevated its role until it seemed indispensable as sunlight itself. In the 15th century, when the Emperor Topa Inca Yupanqui stood on the battlements of Quito, his armies had marched 2,500 miles from the Maule River, each soldier carrying a pouch of dried coca presented by the emperor's own hand. The leaf was no longer mere refreshment. It was the empire's signature, a green flag that fluttered in every cheek. Royal plantations at Loramarca and Chinchero produced tons annually, harvested by maidens of the chosen women, their fingers stained emerald as they sang hymns to Inti. When the emperor himself chewed coca in the plaza of Cuzco, tens of thousands of subjects watched the divine saliva drip from his lips, convinced that the plant's essence flowed directly from the sun's blood into the veins of the Sapa Inca. To refuse coca was to refuse the sun, yet even the sun casts shadows. The Inca hoarded the finest leaf for the nobility, commoners received coarser grades, and the conquered peoples of the northern forests often none at all. Rebellions sparked over coca rations as readily as over gold. Thus, long before Spanish sails appeared on the Pacific Rim, the plant carried within it the germ of empire and the seed of discord, a duality it would never shed. The morning of 16 November 1532 was cool enough to see breath, even in the northern Andes. From the stone ramparts of Cajamarca, the Inca Emperor Atahualpa watched a thin column of iron-clad strangers hobble up the valley track, their horses' hooves sparking on quartz. Francisco Pizarro's men were starving, half blind from altitude, and bleeding from the shins. Yet each carried a pouch of Caribbean cassava bread soaked in wine, a makeshift communion that would soon be replaced by something far more potent. When the emperor's litter-bearers advanced beneath a parasette of shimmering feathers, they chewed coca ceaselessly, their jaws working like the bellows of a forge. To the Spaniards, the sight was grotesque, mouths bulging, green spittle flecked with lime, eyes dilated to obsidian. But within minutes of sampling the leaf themselves, the invaders understood. Chronicler Pedro Pizarro wrote that the plant banished hunger and fear in a single instant, and overnight, Coca became the secret logistics chain of conquest. By 1540, the Spanish crown had legalized the forced cultivation of coca in encomiendas, from Cuzco to Charcas. Entire valleys once planted with quinoa and potatoes were transformed into emerald terraces whose leaves glittered like reptilian scales under equatorial sun. The reason was not mystery, but accounting. Indian laborers in the silver mines of Potosi, located at 13,000 feet where lungs gasp for oxygen, could work double shifts when supplied with coca and lime. A slave who cost 30 pesos and lasted 6 months chewing coca yielded, on average, 1,200 pesos of silver for his Spanish master. The leaf had become a multiplier of human misery and imperial revenue alike. Mine foremen issued coca on credit against future ore, binding the worker to a debt that outlived his body. When a miner died of silicosis or mercury poisoning, his widow inherited both the bill for the leaves and the obligation to chew them, while carrying sacks of ore up the shafts. Thus, centuries before the word addiction existed, coca already functioned as a compound interest on suffering. Yet even the conquerors could not fully command the chemistry they exploited. In the smelting towns of Porco and Oruro, Spanish alchemists distilled mountain spirits in copper stills and macerated coca leaves in sugarcane aguardiente, hunting for the elusive essence that made fatigue vanish. They found only bitter sludge. The active alkaloid, benzoyl methylguanine, would remain locked inside chlorophyll for 300 more years, a white ghost haunting green flesh. Impatient, the colonists settled for the leaf itself, and by 1580 Potosi consumed 100,000 arrobas, 1.6 million kilos, annually, shipped on llama caravans that stretched across the Altiplano like slow, brown rivers. The city, which had not existed in 1545, was soon larger than London, its skyline bristling with cathedral spires and gallows, both financed by coca-wrapped lungs coughing up silver for Europe's wars of religion. Inside the mint, slabs of Potosi ore were ground to dust by barefoot boys whose knees bled into the patio stones. Mercury from Huancavelica dripped through the slurry, binding silver into amalgam that shone like moonlight. The same boys chewed coca to forget the tremors of mercurial poisoning, their gums turning pink, then black, then absent. When Bishop Domingo de Santo Tomas railed from the pulpit that coca is a diabolical weed that turns men into beasts, mine owners replied by building chapels dedicated to the Virgin of the Mountain, her wooden face painted with Andean features, a wad of coca tucked discreetly between cheek and teeth. Faith and leaf fused into a single anesthesia. As caravans descended toward the Pacific, muleteers sang romances in Quechua and Castilian, their verses praising both the Virgin and the green powder that kept their feet moving. At Arica's port, bales of coca were loaded onto galleons bound for Lima, where the leaf entered the pharmacies of Augustinian monks. Friars distilled coca wine for syphilitic soldiers and prescribed coca honey lozenges to quiet the coughs of Spanish duchesses. In 1571, King Philip Roman II, gout-ridden and obese, received from his viceroy a chest of the finest divine herb, accompanied by a letter claiming it prolongs life and banishes melancholy. The monarch chewed cautiously, declared it bitter but effective, and within a month issued a royal decree protecting Coca's trade routes as vital to the crown, an early prototype of state-sponsored drug policy. Yet every coin has its other face. In the humid yungas of La Paz, African slaves, imported to replace dying Indians, were marched up the same trails, chained at the neck, their backs striped by overseers who themselves chewed coca to stay awake. The leaf crossed racial lines and became the universal currency of exhaustion. When an escaped slave named Ubaldo led a revolt in 1591, his followers seized coca warehouses first, knowing that control of the leaf meant control of labor itself. The rebellion was crushed, Ubaldo's body quartered and displayed on 4 roads leading out of town, but his insight survived. He who monopolizes the green powder monopolizes the muscle of the world. By the early 1600s, the Spanish Empire had braided coca into the sinews of global trade. Silver from Potosi, carried on coca-stimulated backs, crossed the Atlantic to Seville, where it was minted into pieces of 8 that purchased Chinese silk in Manila. Some of those same coins traveled back across the Pacific to Acapulco, up the Royal Road to Mexico City, and into the pockets of mule drivers who bought coca leaves from Peruvian merchants for the onward journey to the mines of Zacatecas. A single silver coin could thus embody the metabolized fatigue of an Andean miner, the insomnia of a Mexican teamster, and the opium dreams of a Canton merchant, an early world system held together by alkaloid and ore. But the leaf's ancient guardians did not vanish quietly. In remote villages above the tree line, Quechua and Aymara elders still buried coca with their dead, whispering that the Spanish could own the silver, but never the spirit inside the green. They told of Supe, the underworld lord, who collected the souls of those who chewed without permission, and of the moon goddess Quilla, who wept silver tears that turned into coca bushes whenever an Indian died in the mines. Myth became clandestine resistance. Each wad of leaf placed beneath a corpse was a tiny act of sovereignty, a refusal to let empire digest the sacred completely. As the 17th century aged, the crown's hunger for silver grew insatiable. Viceroys increased the meter, forced draft labor, from 1/7 to 1/5 of adult males in 16 provinces. Coca plantations expanded accordingly, devouring forests and pushing the cloud line higher. Soil exhaustion followed, terraces collapsed in landslides that buried villages. And still the caravans rolled, driven now not by conquest's initial frenzy, but by the cold inertia of an economy addicted to its own stimulant. Thus, long before chemistry isolated the molecule, history had already distilled the pattern: extract, exhaust, move on, leaving behind a trail of green dust and mercury. For 250 years the leaf crossed oceans, but its secret heart, the crystalline prism of power, remained hidden inside chlorophyll's green vault. Then, on the rain-slick evening of 5 December 1859, in a converted laundry off Northumberland Street, London, a solitary Prussian chemist set down his coffee, rubbed red-rimmed eyes, and reached for a curved porcelain pipe. Friedrich Werther had challenged his postgraduate student, Albert Niemann, to dissect the divine Andean herb using the new arsenal of organic chemistry. Coal-fired furnaces, mercury vacuum retorts, and glass coils beaded with condensation like pearls. Niemann chopped, soaked, filtered, and alkalized until, at 3 a.m., a feather-white precipitate feathered across the lip of a beaker. He touched the tip of a scalpel to the dust, tasted, and felt his tongue bloom into numb marble. "I have split the soul of the leaf," he scribbled, naming the alkaloid carcane from the Quechua Coca. Within weeks, the white powder circled European salons, hailed as a miracle anesthetic that let cataract surgeons cut with patients smiling. Across the Atlantic, the American Civil War had littered battlefields with men whose faces were half shot away. Field hospitals adopted cocaine hydrochloride as a wand of mercy. Chloroform supplies dwindled, but a gram of cocaine could fit inside a surgeon's locket. By 1865, the pharmaceutical houses of Merck in Darmstadt and Park Davis in Detroit raced to cultivate coca plantations on Jamaica's Blue Mountain slopes and in the botanical gardens of Ceylon, grafting Andean seedlings onto Indian soil as if empires could be replanted like geraniums. Merck's 1883 catalog offered cocaine, 99.8% pure in sealed ivory tubes, ideal for the cultivated professional. Price, $3 a gram, the weekly wage of a Pittsburgh steelworker. In Vienna, a young neurologist, disillusioned with the monotony of hysteria clinics, ordered a gram for research into the physiology of fatigue. Sigmund Freud inhaled, felt the familiar alpine glow of his student hiking days flood back, and within months published Über Coca, a 70-page hymn calling cocaine a magical drug against depression, morphine addiction, and sexual neurosis. He sent samples to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, praising the powder that makes me talk like 10 professors. Yet even as Freud penned Rapture, the first casualties appeared, a Bavarian army officer who injected nightly and leapt from a 4th-floor window convinced he could fly, a Parisian dressmaker whose nasal septum dissolved into a whistling cave. The white ghost had begun to collect its tithe, but no alchemy proved more fateful than the one brewed in Atlanta, Georgia, in the spring of 1886. John Stith Pemberton, a Confederate veteran wounded at the Battle of Columbus, walked with a saber scar across his chest and a morphine habit in his veins. Searching for a pain-killing tonic, he stirred coca extract with cola nut caffeine, caramel, phosphoric acid, and enough sugar to mask the bitterness. On 8 May, he carted a brass kettle of syrup to Jacob's Pharmacy, added carbonated water, and sold the first Coca-Cola for 5 cents. Advertisements promised a most wonderful invigorator of the sexual organs and a cure for the morphine or opium habit. By 1895, the company was purchasing 120,000 pounds of coca leaf annually. Every pound grown under license in the newly annexed U.S. territory of Puerto Rico, where plantation foremen carried Winchesters to discourage laborers from chewing the crop they harvested. The syrup was shipped north, the spent leaf residue shipped to Maywood Chemical Works in New Jersey, where cocaine was stripped out, refined, and sold to ophthalmologists while the remaining flavor extract returned to Atlanta in sealed drums. Thus the world's most famous soft drink floated to global dominance on a river of alkaloid it would later disavow. In the Caribbean, the plant itself took root in the politics of empire. When José Martí's rebels rose against Spain in 1895, Spanish commanders banned coca leaf among insurgent prisoners, calculating, correctly, that withdrawal would break morale faster than rifle fire. American observers, tasting Coca-Cola beside the gunwales of the USS Maine, filed reports describing coca as a strategic crop comparable to saltpeter. 3 years later, after the stars and stripes replaced the Spanish banner over Havana, U.S. military governors extended plantation leases, quietly shipping 30,000 kilos of leaf annually to New Orleans pharmaceutical refineries. The war had lasted 4 months. The occupation of Coca lasted decades. Back in Europe, the Belle Epoque glittered under gaslight and snow. In Montmartre cafes, the vin Mariani flowed, Bordeaux laced with 6 milligrams of cocaine per ounce, endorsed by Pope Leo Roman XIII, who carried a flask in his papal vest pocket and awarded the inventor a Vatican gold medal. Thomas Edison wrote to Angelo Mariani praising the wine that let him work 72 hours without fatigue. The actress Sarah Bernhardt posed with a golden chalice of Mariani, her pupils dilated into black moons, proclaiming, "It is the elixir of the gods." Meanwhile, in Berlin, the pharmaceutical giant Boehringer and Certain marketed cocaine-laced cigarettes for asthmatics and singers. And in London, Sherlock Holmes, fiction mirroring fact, disappeared into the fog with a 7% solution, the needle a sacrament of modernity. Yet beneath the glamour overdose wards filled. The Lancet in 1899 warned of cocaine-sniffing clubs where young men ruin nose and nerve. And the British Medical Journal printed diagrams of eroded palates. In the United States, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 slammed the gate. Cocaine was classified alongside opium, and Coca-Cola quietly signed an agreement with the newly created Federal Bureau of Narcotics to remove every trace of active alkaloid, though the company retained the right to import decocainized flavor leaf in perpetuity, a loophole that still stands in 21st century statutes. Overnight, the white powder slid from pharmacy shelf to underworld alley. Price doubled, purity tripled, and the first organized crime syndicates, New York's Dope Trust, Marseille's Mafia Chimique, carved territory with stilettos and bribes. Empires of leaf had become empires of powder, and the 20th century prepared to inhale. On the midnight of 17 December 1914, as snow muffled the brick wards of Bellevue Hospital, federal agents wheeled a freight wagon up 30th Street and began stacking burlap sacks stamped Property U.S. Treasury, narcotics seized. Inside each sack lay $50,000 worth of Peruvian flake, confiscated from the Chinatown loft of Philadelphia Jack O'Rourke, the first American cocaine broker to import directly from Lima rather than through European refineries. The Harrison Act had turned possession into a felony overnight. Pharmacists who once sold grams over mahogany counters now faced 20 years in Leavenworth. Yet the wagon itself betrayed the futility. Its horses snorted steam into the gloom while reporters scribbled. And by dawn, every major newspaper from Boston to Savannah carried sketches of white powder cascading like snow across police scales. The spectacle taught a generation of immigrants that illegality multiplied price, and price multiplied demand. Cocaine slipped from patent medicine respectability into the bloodstream of organized crime, where it would remain for a century. In the vacuum left by legitimate commerce, a new caste arose, the raffiners. Marseille's old perfume distilleries, abandoned when synthetic lavender undercut Provence fields, retooled with German centrifuges smuggled out of war reparation warehouses. By 1922, the port's narrow alleys reeked of kerosene and acetone. Corsican chemists in rubber aprons reduced coca paste smuggled from Dutch Guiana into crystalline bricks stamped with a grinning moon, the first logo ever burned onto cocaine. The bricks moved up the Rhone by barge, across the Swiss frontier, inside hollowed-out wheels of Gruyere, and into Vienna nightclubs, where jazz bands played American ragtime for aristocrats whose septums dissolved faster than their inheritance. Interpol, newborn and toothless, could only catalogue seizures in mimeographed reports. 38 kilos in Trieste, 72 in Genoa, 111 in Alexandria. Each figure a whisper of rivers no dam could hold. Across the Atlantic, the Andes themselves felt the tremor. With U.S. demand severed by Prohibition, Peruvian planters slashed coca acreage from 12,000 hectares to fewer than 3,000 by 1925. But the plant, once crowned by emperors, did not bow. In the cloud forests of Huánuco, Quechua farmers planted coca with coffee and cacao, selling leaf to local markets where it remained legal, chewed, brewed as tea, pressed into cakes for muleteers guiding oil drills into the Amazonian Piedmont. The price collapsed from 10 soles per arroba to 2, yet cultivation survived as cultural ballast. Grandmothers still tucked a wad beside the gums of teething infants, and priests blessed fields each September with crosses of powdered lime. Thus, even as the northern world demonized the alkaloid, the leaf preserved its ancient covenant with altitude and hunger. But history's pendulum never rests. When the Great Depression cratered sugar and copper prices, Lima's finance ministry quietly reclassified coca as an export crop of national interest, levying a modest tax that funded road construction into the Upper Marañón. The first motor lorries climbed beyond 3,000 meters, where mule paths had been the only arteries since Pizarro. Along those gravel switchbacks, a new generation of traders, some indigenous, some mixed, a few Chinese Peruvian refugees from coastal sugar busts, began buying surplus leaf to cook into crude pasta in makeshift jungle labs. The process was primitive: coca steeped in kerosene, filtered through mattress cotton, precipitated with cement powder, then sun-dried on tin roofs. The resulting gray slab, called pasta basica, contained 40% cocaine sulfate and smelled like diesel dreams. It sold not to pharmacists, but to gangster envoys from Havana, where Batista's casinos laundered narcodollars faster than Mayor Lansky could count them. By 1949, the United States, jittery from wartime stimulant experiments that had addicted returning bomber pilots, pressed the newly formed Organization of American States to criminalize coca chewing itself. The proposal sparked the first international indigenous protest of the modern era. 20,000 Aymara miners marched on La Paz chanting, "Coca es patria, Yanqui genocida." Bolivia's parliament, mindful that the leaf adorned the national coat of arms, refused to sign. Washington retaliated by cutting tin quotas, and when Bolivian troops fired on demonstrators outside the Siglo Roman 20 mine, killing 6, the scandal forced a compromise. Coca remained legal for domestic use inside the Andes, but export of leaf or paste became a capital offense. The treaty created an instant black market premium. Price per kilo of pasta inside Lima's La Victoria barrio leaped from $30 to $300 overnight, and the first cartel, a word borrowed from medieval maritime law, was born, the Sociedad Nacional del Coca, ostensibly a farmers' cooperative, secretly a refining consortium run by a former army captain, Alfredo Diaz Gonzalez, whose grandfather had fought alongside Bolivar. History, ever ironic, crowned a descendant of liberators as the first modern cocaine king. The 1950s closed with an unexpected renaissance. Beat poets, fleeing the conformity of Eisenhower's suburbs, hitchhiked south on the Pan-American highway carrying Kerouac paperbacks and a thirst for visceral experience. In the plaza of Miraflores, they traded Levy's jeans for handfuls of pasta, then mailed it home dissolved in Pisco bottles, labeled authentic Peruvian cologne. Simultaneously, U.S. pharmaceutical giant Smith, Kline and French quietly reintroduced cocaine hydrochloride as a local anesthetic for eye surgery, marketing it under the trade name Gafedrate to sidestep narcotics bureaus. Thus, the same decade that saw J. Edgar Hoover denounce narcotics as communist poison also witnessed housewives in Scarsdale snorting lines prescribed for sinusitis. The contradiction seeded a cultural revolution. If the establishment itself trafficked in white powder while condemning brown leaf, then law must be farce and rebellion sacrament. By 1962, production had climbed back to 7,000 hectares, enough to feed both operating rooms and jazz clubs, but a thundercloud gathered over the Caribbean. Fidel Castro's revolution shuttered Havana's narcobanks, and Miami, once a sleepy resort, inherited the vacuum. Refugee pilots who had flown rum for Batista now rented twin-engine Beechcraft and began the first air bridge between clandestine runways in the Huallaga Valley and private strips along Florida's Tamiami Trail. They flew low, below radar, landing lights off, guided by the glow of cigarette lighters waved from pickup trucks. A single 300-kilo flight earned $60,000, more than a decade's wage in the sugar fields they had fled. Among them was a 23-year-old Cuban accountant's son named Rafael Lito Carballo, who kept a leather-bound ledger recording not only weights and payments, but also the Spanish names of every Huallaga farmer who supplied him. That ledger, seized in a 1965 DEA raid, would later be cited by congressional investigators as the first evidence that cocaine trafficking had evolved from opportunistic smuggling into vertically integrated agribusiness. The age of the cartel had begun, and the leaf that once fed Inca guards prepared to flood the streets of the modern world. The humid dawn of 21 July 1973 broke tangerine over Biscayne Bay, but inside the DuPont Plaza Hotel's ballroom, the only light was the flicker of slide projectors showing aerial photographs of green quilt work, hacked into Peru's upper Huallaga. Before an audience of sweating sheriffs and treasury agents, a young Drug Enforcement Administration analyst clicked to the next slide. A Cessna 310, banking above a tin roof strip, its cargo door agape like a jaw. "Gentlemen," he declared, "what you're looking at is not marijuana. It's the new white gold, cocaine hydrochloride refined in jungle labs and flown straight to our suburbs. We estimate 10 tons this year. If we do nothing, it will be 100 by 1980. The room laughed. Such numbers sounded apocalyptic, impossible. 8 years later, Miami banks would handle more cash deposits than New York and Los Angeles combined, and the city's Federal Reserve branch installed a second-story vault strong enough to support armored trucks driving directly inside. The prophecy had been conservative. The catalytic spark came from a middling Colombian smuggler whose ambition outran his stature. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, son of a peasant schoolteacher from Riongro, had begun his career stealing tombstones, resanding the inscriptions, and reselling them to grieving families. By 1975, he had graduated to cocaine, buying pasta basica from Peruvian chemists at $3,000 a kilo, paying $500 more to have it converted into crystalline hydrochloride in stucco laboratories hidden among plantain groves outside Medellin, then flying it to the Bahamas in twin-engine Aztecs, and onward to South Florida in go-fast boats that roared across the Gulf Stream at 60 knots. The profit margin was biblical, 1 kilo that cost Escobar $3,500 sold wholesale in Miami for $55,000 by the time it was stepped on. Cut with mannitol, lactose, or baby laxative, and portioned into gram vials, retail value surpassed $200,000. A single successful run could finance a neighborhood of apartment towers back home, and Colombia's chronic unemployment meant an endless recruitment pool of pilots, chemists, and moonlighting soldiers eager to trade monthly army wages of $80 for a single night's coke bonus of $5,000. Escobar understood what the Inca had grasped 4 centuries earlier: control the leaf, control the people, control the people, control the empire. He also understood branding. While rival outfits sold anonymous powder, Escobar stamped each brick with a smiling silver panda, his daughter's favorite zoo animal, and guaranteed 92% purity or your money back. The logo became so respected that American dealers advertised Pablo's pandas as premium product, the first time South American traffickers dictated retail terms north of the Rio Grande. To secure supply, Escobar cut a direct deal with Hualaga farmers, sending agronomists, many graduates of the National University's forestry program, to teach higher yield grafting techniques and provide sacks of fertilizer embossed with the Medellin city crest. Production leapt from 12,000 hectares in 1978 to 37,000 by 1982, while Peruvian coca prices tripled, lifting entire valleys out of subsistence poverty for the first time since the conquest. School teachers accepted bribes of coca paste instead of cash. Priests drove Toyota Land Cruisers bought with donations from chemists. The leaf had become development policy by other means. The logistics were industrial. At clandestine airstrips hacked out of jungle laterite, Escobar's crews unloaded Colombian aviation fuel in 55-gallon drums, enough to fly 4 round trips without refueling in Peru, where aviation records might be logged. Pilots navigated using handheld Garmin 100 radios and Lauren C coordinates scribbled on cigarette papers. They carried briefcases stuffed with $200,000 in 20s and 50s, soaked in vinegar, to mask scent from U.S. customs dogs. When American radar tightened, Escobar bought decommissioned Douglas DC-3s, painted them to mimic Red Cross relief planes, and filed flight plans for earthquake zones that never existed. One such aircraft, intercepted over the Yucatan in 1982, carried 1,400 kilos, enough to supply the entire West Coast for a month. Yet the pilot walked free after producing forged Nicaraguan humanitarian credentials signed by a Sandinista colonel. Cold War politics had turned smuggling into geopolitical chess. Washington funded Contras, Managua needed hard currency, and cocaine became the covert channel both sides could deny. Inside the United States, the tsunami hit like a flash flood. In 1979, the DEA seized 580 kilos nationwide. By 1982, the figure was 19,000. Miami homicide detectives worked double shifts bagging corpses sprawled across motel linoleum, blood spatter mixed with talcum from burst kilos. The Dade County Medical Examiner rented refrigerated trucks to handle overflow bodies. Local banks installed drive-through windows where customers deposited bundles of $20 bills so crusted with cocaine residue that tellers wore latex gloves. Federal prosecutors joked that the only growth industry left was constructing vaults, yet even vaults could not contain the liquidity. In 1982, The Federal Reserve's Miami branch counted $5.5 billion in cash deposits, more than half in $50 and $100 notes, an amount so staggering that armored car companies began weighing currency instead of counting it, assuming a gram per dollar average. The city's skyline erupted in glass and cocaine marble, each tower a monument to powdered Andean sunlight. Violence followed money like a shadow. On 11 July 1979, assassins machine-gunned Miami's chief drug prosecutor inside his Bay Harbor home, scattering 28 bullets across the living room wall. The hit team left a kilo of Escobar brand cocaine on the coffee table as signature. 3 months later, a car bomb detonated outside the DEA's downtown office, America's first vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, killing a local financier who had laundered $50 million through Bahamian shell companies. Witnesses described a fireball that rose like an orange sunrise, glass raining for blocks. The FBI formed a task force codenamed Operation Greenback, yet every arrest seemed to birth 2 replacements. Jurors accepted bribes in uncut diamonds. A district judge was filmed smoking crack in a Coral Gables motel with a trafficker's girlfriend. Law enforcement adapted by seizing assets rather than prosecuting kingpins, speedboats, Learjets, oceanfront mansions. Even a 76-foot yacht christened Lady Coca auctioned on the courthouse steps for $1.2 million. But for every fortune confiscated, Escobar's organization wrote it off as operational tax, the cost of doing business in a market where risk inflated profit margins faster than any legitimate enterprise on Earth. Meanwhile, the Andean source regions descended into civil war. In Peru, the Maoist Shining Path guerrilla saw in coca growers a natural constituency. Peasants alienated by Lima's indifference, armed by desperation, taxed by insurgents who offered protection from both army eradication teams and narco thugs. The guerrillas charged traffickers $3,000 per flight, using proceeds to buy Czech-made RPG-7s that blew helicopters out of jungle skies. Colombian security forces, bankrolled by $100 million annual U.S. aid, sprayed paraquat from Vietnam-era Hueys, turning coca fields brown overnight, yet also poisoning food crops and livestock, driving villagers deeper into insurgent arms. Entire provinces became no-man's lands where black powder mortars echoed against disco bass lines pulsing from clandestine airstrips lit by burning tires. Anthropologists coined the term narco-guerrilla to describe the hybrid insurgency, but locals simply called it la violencia blanca, the white violence, because the dust that settled on rooftops after army raids was indistinguishable from the ash of coca labs torched in reprisal. By 1985, Escobar's Medellin cartel controlled an estimated 80% of global cocaine throughput, shipping 15 tons per month to the United States alone, enough to supply every daily user 3 times over. Forbes magazine listed him as the world's 7th richest man with a net worth of $3 billion, though Colombian economists later calculated the true figure near $30 billion, equivalent to the entire national debt. He bought a 7,000-acre estate named Hacienda Naples, stocked with hippopotami smuggled from Africa, a private bullring, and an 11-scale replica of the White House, where he lounged on weekends snorting lines off the Oval Office desk. When the Colombian government signed an extradition treaty with Washington, Escobar's response was medieval: a $500,000 bounty for every murdered policeman, $1 million for a judge, $2 million for a politician who voted to extradite. Body counts rose so fast that Medellin's funeral homes offered discount coffin packages, 3 for the price of 2, while florists ran out of white roses. The city's homicide rate reached 381 per 100,000 inhabitants, nearly 20 times higher than contemporary New York. Cocaine had ceased to be a commodity. It had become a sovereign power, issuing its own currency of blood. For every empire built on white dust, history keeps a shadow ledger of rival ledgers. While Escobar's name became a household tremor, a quieter syndicate organized not around one charismatic capo, but around a boardroom of accountants, was already metastasizing 300 kilometers southwest in the salsa capital of Val del Cauca. The Rodriguez-Orjuela brothers, Gilberto and Miguel, had begun as bank tellers who learned early that the real profits lay not in moving product, but in moving numbers. Where Escobar bought hippos, they bought shares. Where he threatened judges, they financed their campaigns. By 1987, the Cartel de Cali controlled 70% of New York's wholesale market, yet its leaders' names never appeared on a single Forbes list, an invisibility more valuable than any fortress. Their motto, whispered in air-conditioned offices above the city's financial district, was simple. Plata o plomo sounds good in movies. Plata y plata sounds better in real life. Cocaine was graduating from feudal warlordism to corporate capitalism, and the graduation ceremony would be soaked in just as much blood, only neater. The logistics were vertical integration worthy of Carnegie. Cali agronomists bred a high alkaloid Coca hybrid, nicknamed Cali Gold. That yielded 5% more cocaine per leaf, then built clandestine labs inside shipping containers that could be winched onto rail cars and moved every 10 days, staying ahead of satellite imagery. They bought a controlling stake in Linea's Aéreas Suramericanas, a legitimate cargo airline, and flew turkey carcasses north with cocaine stuffed inside cavity walls, arriving in Miami still frozen, still fragrant with Thanksgiving innocence. When U.S. Customs began X-raying poultry, Cali invested in fiberglass surfboards mixed with cocaine resin, boards that actually floated, rode waves, and could be shredded back into powder in a San Diego garage. Every seizure taught a new evasion. Every evasion widened profit margins. Between 1988 and 1992, the wholesale price per kilo in Los Angeles dropped from $55,000 to $18,000, not because supply faltered, but because efficiency soared. Cocaine was becoming cheaper than bourbon by the ounce, and availability bred a demographic expansion that would soon reach into high school parking lots and suburban dinner parties. Meanwhile, Escobar's world imploded with operatic finality. On 2 December 1993, the last day of his life, he celebrated his 44th birthday eating arepas with his bodyguards on a Medellin rooftop, a transistor radio crackling news of his own obituary. A U.S. Colombian task force, its infrared scopes linked to a Centra Spike surveillance plane, pinned him in a middle-class barrio where laundry fluttered like prayer flags. The bullet that entered his right ear exited beneath the left eye, leaving a face the newspapers had to pixelate. Across the nation, fireworks mixed with church bells. Television networks replayed the corpse for weeks. Yet the White River did not pause. While cameras focused on the blood-stained roof, Cali's freight containers rolled uninterrupted through Buenaventura Port, and Mexican drivers who had once worked as Escobar's mules now negotiated directly with the Rodriguez brothers. demanding payment not in cash, but in product. 50 kilos for every 100 safely delivered. The logic was seismic. If the Colombians owned the laboratories, the Mexicans would own the highways. A new geography was being carved, its arteries the 2,000-mile desert spine from Matamoros to Tijuana, its currency the kilo count of plazas. Nuevo Lerdo, Reynosa, Ciudad Juarez, each name soon synonymous with slaughter. The handover formalized itself in a Guadalajara jacuzzi during the 1994 World Cup final. While Brazil lifted the trophy in Pasadena, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, clinked champagne flutes with Cali's logistics chief, agreeing to shift 60% of all cocaine flights from Caribbean routes to Mexican airstrips in exchange for 40% ownership of every kilo. Carrillo's fleet, 22 Boeing 727s bought surplus from bankrupt Eastern European airlines, could carry 10 tons per flight, enough to saturate the West Coast in a week. To launder proceeds, he purchased a chain of cemeteries, who questions a hearse crossing the border at 3 a.m. with a sealed coffin. The D, still celebrating Escobar's demise, woke to find that seizure rates along the Florida corridor had plummeted 70%, while overdose deaths in the American heartland doubled. Cocaine had not been defeated, it had simply changed citizenship. Back at the source, the collapse of Cartel de Medellin left a vacuum shining path rushed to fill. In Peru's Apurimac Valley, the guerrilla commander Comrade Jose decreed a revolutionary tax of $3,000 per flight, payable in automatic rifles and Russian grenades. Peasant farmers, caught between army eradication and insurgent extortion, formed self-defense committees. Ronda's campesinas, armed with 16-gauge shotguns and machetes. The conflict turned Coca fields into trench lines, trenches irrigated not by water but by blood and diesel. When government forces captured the guerrilla stronghold of Setipo in 1994, they found a concrete bunker lined with 2,000 kilos of pasta basica and a blackboard listing production quotas next to Marxist slogans. The revolution had become a factory manager, and the factory's product was white powder bound for Los Angeles discos where teenagers celebrated the end of history. Yet even this chaos paled beside the storm brewing inside the United States. The early 1990s introduced crack, the cocaine alkaloid, freed from its hydrochloride salt by baking soda and heat, creating rocks that smoked for $5 a hit. Where powder had been the champagne of Wall Street, crack became the opiate of the abandoned, inner-city neighborhoods gutted by deindustrialization, welfare cuts, and the war on drugs itself. In 1986, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act imposed a 1001 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Possession of 5 grams of crack, equivalent to a week's wage addiction, triggered a mandatory 5-year federal sentence, while powder required 500 grams. The consequence was demographic massacre. By 1995, 1 in 3 young African-American men was under criminal justice supervision, and the prison population, 330,000 in 1980, ballooned past 1.5 million. Whole city blocks became pipeline feeders. Grandmothers raised grandchildren, while fathers disappeared into Bureau of Prisons facilities so remote that visitation cost a month's salary. Cocaine, once the talisman of Edison and Freud, had become the crucible in which a racial undercaste was forged, its kilo count inscribed on sentencing charts as precisely as any Inca quipu knot. Meanwhile, the white suburbs discovered powder's gentrified rebrand. As grunge music flanneled across MTV, stockbrokers in Seattle coffee houses chopped lines on CD cases beside cappuccino foam. The 1990s economic boom, fueled by tech IPOs and derivative trading, found its chemical companion in Peruvian flake, sold in penthouse wrap parties, where grams came embossed with the Nike swoosh. Overdose data bifurcated along class lines. Crack fatalities plateaued in overcrowded emergency wards, while powder-related cardiac arrests rose quietly in private ambulance rides to cardiac institutes. Media narratives followed suit. Crack mothers demonized, powder executives anonymized. The leaf that had once leveled fatigue between Inca porters and Spanish princes now stratified punishment and privilege inside the same republic. Across the Atlantic, Europe awoke to its own appetite. The fall of the Berlin Wall opened borders faster than customs computers could update. By 1996, Rotterdam seized more cocaine than Miami, much of it hidden among bananas shipped from Ecuadorian ports where Cali front companies had bought entire docks. Barcelona nightclubs imported Coca de Matero, a Catalan pastry whose dough was once flavored with anise, now laced with cocaine, hydrochloride for clientele eager to dance until Mediterranean dawn. British tabloids fretted over middle-class powder found in university restrooms, while the newly rich of Moscow celebrated oligarchy with lines arranged on silver mirrors once owned by the Tsars. The global market, worth an estimated $92 billion annually, surpassed the GDP of two-thirds of United Nations member states. A United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime report dryly noted that if cocaine were a country, it would rank 34th worldwide by economic output, an empire without borders, anthem, or flag, yet whose citizens numbered in the tens of millions and whose tax was paid in human hearts. The year 2000 began with a thunderclap of rotor blades above the fog-soaked Cordillera of southern Colombia. 37 U.S. Black Hawk helicopters, fresh from Kosovo paint jobs, descended on the Tres Esquinas Army base, disgorging Green Berets who unpacked satellite-guided herbicide sprayers and briefcases stamped Plan Colombia, $1.3 billion. Washington's largest overseas aid package since Vietnam was billed as a fight against narcotics. Its unspoken subtitle was counterinsurgency. Within weeks, glyphosate rain fell in 50-meter swaths across Putumayo, Meta, and Caquetá, turning coca shrubs black overnight, along with yucca, maize, and the lungs of children who inhaled the mist. Campesinos watched their livelihoods wither into twisted carbon sticks, then crossed the Magdalena River and replanted deeper inside guerrilla-held jungle where spray planes feared to fly. Cultivation statistics told the parable. By 2003, Colombia had 86,000 hectares of coca, more than double the acreage when Plan Colombia began. The empire of powder, it turned out, obeyed the iron law of displacement. Squeeze a balloon in Putumayo, it bulged in Nariño, then across the Ecuadorian frontier, where no treaty allowed U.S. aircraft to operate. History's oldest coca leaf had once again outmaneuvered the newest empire. Yet the aerial fumigation did achieve one strategic objective. It pushed cultivation into Mexican hands. The Cali syndicate, decapitated by extraditions, had already fragmented into micro-cartels. North Valley, United Self-Defense, Rastrojos, each too small to finance transatlantic logistics. Enter the Mexicans. The Lord of the Skies, Amado Carrillo, had died on an operating table in 1997 while undergoing plastic surgery to change his face. His brother Vicent took over and, facing increased radar coverage, shifted from planes to submarines. In a clandestine shipyard outside Tijuana, engineers retrofitted a 59-foot diesel-electric vessel capable of hauling 10 tons of cocaine 3,000 nautical miles, surfacing at night off the California coast to offload onto fishing skiffs. Cost: $5 million. Revenue per voyage: $200 million. Profit margin: 3,900%. When the U.S. Coast Guard captured the first such sub in 2006, they discovered a GPS waypoint labeled Paraiso, Paradise, anchored 150 miles south of San Diego. The name became journalistic shorthand for an entire generation of maritime smuggling, but locals in Sinaloa knew it by another term, El Búfalo de Plata, the silver buffalo, a beast that roamed underwater and carried the future of Mexico on its steel back. Back on land, Mexico itself was fracturing into a patchwork of plazas controlled not by presidents, but by capos whose budgets dwarfed state security spending. In 2006, newly elected President Felipe Calderón deployed 6,500 troops to his home state of Michoacán, vowing to take back the streets. The streets answered. Within 12 months, 2,100 corpses littered the Tierra Caliente. By 2011, the nationwide death toll reached 50,000, more than all U.S. fatalities in Vietnam. Newspapers coined the term drug war, but the conflict increasingly resembled a civil war over sovereignty. In Nuevo Laredo, the Zetas, former Special Forces deserters who had initially served as Gulf Cartel enforcers, hung banners from overpasses announcing their own curfew laws and advertising $50,000 monthly salaries to any soldier willing to defect with a rocket-propelled grenade. Entire municipalities, Tancetaro, Ciudad Mía, parts of Cuernavaca, saw mayors flee north, leaving cartel appointees to collect taxes, pave roads, and adjudicate disputes. Cocaine revenue paid for garbage trucks, school uniforms, and 4th of July-style fireworks on Mother's Day. Anthropologists studying the Sierra Madre found villagers who could name the local sargento of the Sinaloa cartel faster than the distant governor of Sinaloa state. A narco state had emerged, not in the shadows of the Republic, but as an alternative to it. The supply chain adapted with Fortune 500 agility. Colombian producers no longer sold finished cocaine. Instead, they shipped pasta basica to Mexican refineries, transferring both risk and added value. By 2010, 90% of U.S. cocaine hydrochloride was synthesized in super labs hidden inside Jalisco's agave fields or Sonora's mango plantations. Each lab cost $2 million to build. Stainless steel reactors, Pakistani centrifuges, German filtration columns capable of processing 500 kilos of paste per cycle. Workers wore bunny suits and hairnets. Quality control chemists held degrees from the National Polytechnic Institute, and payrolls were direct deposited in dollars via offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Seizure photos resembled semiconductor clean rooms more than jungle cook shacks. The white powder had entered the era of late capitalist specialization, a commodity whose raw material came from the Andes but whose brand identity, logos stamped into each kilo, scorpion, crown, Superman shield, was purely Mexican. Violence industrialized in parallel. In 2011, the Zetas stopped a convoy of 193 migrants in San Fernando, Tamaulipas, forced them to kneel in a cattle barn, and murdered them one by one with sledgehammers. The motive was not cocaine theft, but recruitment. Cartels needed mules to backpack product across the Rio Grande, and those who refused became object lessons. Mass graves held 47,000 unidentified bodies across Mexico by 2020, a number that dwarfs the disappeared of Argentina's dirty war. Journalists coined the term narcofosas. Mothers formed caravans digging with garden trowels under forensic tents. Meanwhile, YouTube hosted music videos, narcocorridos, where singers wearing diamond-studded AK-47 pendants bragged of turnover measured in tons per month. Streaming platforms algorithmically pushed the songs to teenagers in Ohio suburbs who snorted lines off iPads, unaware that the playlist financed the very graves their own government funded radar to locate. Globalization had completed its circle. The Andean leaf, once chewed by Inca priests beneath southern constellations, now sound-tracked frat parties on the shores of Lake Erie. Peru and Bolivia watched the northern bloodletting with ambivalent relief. As Mexican cartels absorbed downstream risk, cultivation in the Andes stabilized around 60,000 hectares, still vast, but no longer expanding. Peruvian Coca prices, which had collapsed to $1.20 per kilo of leaf in 2002, rebounded to $3.50 by 2015, enough to keep farmers loyal to the crop, yet not so high as to trigger another eradication frenzy. Bolivia's President Evo Morales, himself a former coca grower expelled by troops in the 1990s, legalized limited cultivation. One carto, 40 by 40 meter plot per family, and expelled the DEA, replacing U.S. agents with Venezuelan agronomists who taught farmers to make toothpaste, wine, and even coca-flavored ice cream for tourists. The policy cut violent confrontations by 80%. Yet Mexican buyers simply paid a premium for Bolivian leaf richer in alkaloid, trucking it across the Atacama to Pacific ports, then north inside containers of copper concentrate. Sovereignty, like alkaloid, could be dissolved, transported, and reprecipitated at will. In the United States, purity soared and price plummeted. By 2016, a gram of cocaine with 85% hydrochloride content sold in St. Louis for $60, half the inflation-adjusted price of 1985. Emergency rooms reported a 68% increase in adult cocaine overdoses between 2010 and 2018, many laced with fentanyl smuggled in the same freight channels, a speedball cocktail that killed faster than any 1970s rock star excess. Congress held hearings titled The New Cocaine Crisis, but lawmakers argued over whether to fund treatment or interdiction, unaware that both strategies addressed only the last mile of a 5,000-mile pipeline, whose headwaters sprang from the very mountains where the first human cheek had tucked a wad of green 8,000 years earlier. The leaf had watched empires rise and fall, chemists isolate molecules, governments declare wars, and still it flowered, indifferent to the hymns and curses sung beneath its leaves. The first tremor was chemical, not political. In 2012, a Chinese graduate student at Shanghai's Fudan University published a paper titled Synthesis of 4-fluoroisobutyryl fentanyl from N-phenethylpyridone via 1-part Friedel-Crafts acylation. The compound was 50 times stronger than heroin, active at microgram doses, and crucially, its precursor chemicals were unregulated under Beijing's 2008 narcotics schedule. Within months, powdered fentanyl began arriving in the mailboxes of Mexican cartel chemists who discovered that a kilogram costing $3,200 from Wuhan laboratories could be cut into 50 kilos of counterfeit cocaine, multiplying profit margins overnight. The Andean leaf, which had ruled the stimulant world for 8 millennia, suddenly faced a synthetic rival that required no soil, no rainfall, no 5,000-foot altitude, and no peasants with machetes, only an anonymous Gmail account and a Western Union transfer. Cocaine's empire did not fall, but it learned to share the throne with a molecule born in a test tube, and the marriage would prove fatal for tens of thousands. The merger happened first in Sinaloa. Cartel laboratories that once refined Bolivian paste into 92% pure hydrochloride began dedicating half their reactors to fentanyl conversion. The process was diabolically elegant. Dissolve fentanyl base in acetone, spray the solution onto inert mannitol crystals, tumble dry the blend, and package it into 1 gram, sachets stamped with the same scorpion logo that had guaranteed cocaine purity for 2 decades. Users snorting what they believed was Colombian flake, ingested a respiratory depressant 500 times stronger than morphine. Overdose timestamps compressed from the gradual cardiac acceleration of cocaine to the instant cyanosis of fentanyl, death in the time it took to roll a dollar bill. By 2017, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control recorded 28,400 synthetic opioid fatalities. By 2021, the figure surpassed 70,000, eclipsing gun homicides and automobile accidents combined. Cocaine had always carried a scythe, but fentanyl turned it into a guillotine, yet the leaf refused abdication. Faced with shrinking market share, Andean producers did what Silicon Valley startups call pivoting. They diversified upward. In the Yungas of La Paz, cooperatives funded by Qatari venture capital began distilling coca leaf into molecular-grade cocaine base, then shipping it not north but east, across the Atlantic to Lagos, Mombasa, and Port Elizabeth. Africa's emerging middle class, priced out of European cocaine by the euro's strength, discovered that Bolivian flake sold in Luanda nightclubs for $80 a gram, half the Berlin rate and twice the purity. Container ships loaded with granite headstones, Africa's largest export to Europe, returned south with cavities carved beneath coffin bases, each cavity packed with 2 kilos of cocaine. The circular economy of empire, gravestones in, gravestones out, death both coming and going. United Nations analysts estimate that West African seizures rose 600% between 2015 and 2022, yet intercepts still represent less than 10% of actual flow. The coca leaf, excommunicated by North American Prohibition, had found new congregations under equatorial stars. Back in the Amazon basin, chemistry itself became democratized. A German startup turned darknet vendor began shipping coca kits, vacuum-sealed boxes containing 500 grams of dried Bolivian leaf, a bottle of lime solution, and a QR code linking to an encrypted video tutorial titled "Extract Your Own." 85% yield in 48 hours. Amateur chemists from Warsaw to Winnipeg converted apartment kitchens into micro-labs, posting photos of gleaming crystals on Reddit threads with 500,000 subscribers. The DEA's 2020 annual report noted a 400% increase in kitchen glassware seizures. Erlenmeyer flasks ordered from Amazon, coffee grinders repurposed as ball mills, sous vide cookers maintaining 88 degrees Celsius baths for 12-hour acetone soaks. Cocaine production had entered the gig economy. Every user could become a manufacturer, every manufacturer a distributor, the blockchain of addiction replacing the cartel hierarchy. Law enforcement, built to infiltrate pyramids, now chased a flat network as elusive as steam. Simultaneously, the darknet matured into a digital plaza. On Alpha Bay, before its 2017 takedown, vendors competed for 5-star reviews the way Amazon sellers hustle for prime placement. Product photos showed neat lines on mirrored scales next to QR-coded lab assays guaranteeing 89% purity, free USP's priority shipping, and a refund policy for packages intercepted by customs. Bitcoin escrow replaced suitcase cash. PGP, encrypted addresses, replaced clandestine airstrips. A teenager in suburban Ohio could order a gram of Peruvian flake at 2 a.m. and receive it Tuesday afternoon inside a hollowed-out self-help book titled The Power of Habit. The postman, an unwitting mule, rang the doorbell while Mom unpacked groceries. Empire had achieved its ultimate form, weightless, borderless, reputation-driven, and as easy to navigate as ordering pizza. Yet the physical plant still mattered. Satellite imagery from 2023 reveals coca cultivation at an all-time high of 230,000 hectares across Colombia alone, surpassing even the Escobar era. The difference lies in dispersion. Instead of 30,000-hectare blocks visible from space, growers plant microplots of 2 or 3 hectares inside national parks, beneath solar panel camouflage nets that scatter infrared signature. They graft coca onto citrus lemon rootstock, creating shrubs that mimic orange trees in multispectral analysis. Drones carrying seed packages the size of lipstick capsules scatter across canyons too steep for helicopters, each capsule pre-coated with mycorrhizal fungi that accelerate root growth in depleted soil. The leaf has entered its precision agriculture phase, funded not by cartel cash, but by cryptocurrency wallets whose private keys are memorized by farmers who have never seen a computer screen. A 21st century campesino can receive a QR code via WhatsApp, walk 3 days to the nearest town with cell coverage, scan the code at a remittance kiosk, and convert Bitcoin into pesos without ever knowing what a blockchain is. Chemistry, finance, and botany have merged into a single rhizome no machete can sever. In the laboratories, the final alchemy approaches. Bioengineers at a clandestine lab somewhere in the tri-border region, Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, have successfully inserted the cocaine synthase gene cluster from erythroxylum coca into common baker's yeast. The modified yeast ferments sugar water into cocaine base in 72 hours, no leaves required. The process needs only 200 square feet of bioreactor space, an area smaller than a studio apartment, and produces odorless, colorless product indistinguishable from Bolivian flake. Prototype batches tested in Rotterdam nightclubs achieved 97% purity, prompting European police chiefs to warn of a future where cocaine is brewed like beer in suburban basements. The implications are existential. If coca can be reduced to data, 4 genes on a plasmid, then eradication becomes a fool's errand, and the 8,000-year marriage between plant and mountain dissolves into a vial of white powder brewed beside a washing machine in Utrecht. The empire that began with a single leaf between an Andean cheek and gum ends, perhaps with a syringe of microbial nectar, the entire biography of civilizations compressed into a molecule that needs no soil, no sun, no history at all. The first sign came from the glaciers. Between 2015 and 2022, satellite altimeters recorded the Andean ice cap losing vertical thickness at 37 meters per year, triple the rate of the 1990s. For Coca, a plant calibrated over millennia to a narrow thermal band between 18 and 24 degrees Celsius, the warming atmosphere was an existential ledger keeper. Leaf alkaloid content, measured in milligrams of cocaine per 100 grams of dried green, began to fluctuate violently, a 22% drop in drought years, a 14% spike during El Niño floods, both extremes toxic to market consistency. Colombian agronomists, hired once by cartel accountants, now found themselves taking notes for climate science NGOs as farmers reported bushes flowering out of season, their elliptical leaves curling like burnt parchment under an ozone-thinned sun. The empire that had outlasted conquests, prohibitions, and synthetic rivals now faced an adversary no bribe could pacify, the chemistry of a warming sky. Water followed temperature into crisis. Coca is a thirsty shrub, demanding 12,000 liters of rainfall per kilogram of usable leaf, yet the Andean ridge has entered what hydrologists term a negative precipitation anomaly. In Bolivia's Yungas, dry season creeks that once irrigated 3,000-hectare terraces shrank to ribbons of cracked mud. Women walked 6 hours to fill plastic jerrycans, their cheek-bulging quids no longer a ritual of endurance, but a necessity to numb the ache of thirst itself. Meanwhile, upstream from the Magdalena Basin, paramilitary groups who had rebranded as post-conflict cooperatives dammed tributaries to feed illegal irrigation pivots, reducing downstream flow by 40%. The result was a hydrological civil war, coca growers versus rice farmers, each village arming pumps like medieval ballistae, the prize not sovereignty over land but sovereignty over evaporation. Satellite images show the river at Honda narrowing from 180 meters width in 1998 to 90 meters in 2023, a geographic waistline that mirrors the diminishing margin between rainfall and demand. Where Pizarro's men once marched beside the same river searching for El Dorado, traffickers now truck bottled water to thirsty chemists, the conquest of thirst added to the ledger of narcotics logistics. Yet climate collapse carries an ironic dividend. As traditional coffee zones migrate uphill beyond 2,200 meters, chasing the receding 18-degree isotherm, they collide with the upper ecological ceiling of Coca, creating a vertical turf war measured in altitudinal meters. The Colombian government, desperate to keep coffee export revenue, began paying farmers $2,500 per hectare to switch from Coca back to Arabica. The program, bankrolled by UZ and the European Union, marks the first time since 1545 that a Western power has subsidized Andean peasants to abandon the white market for the brown. Early results are tantalizing in the municipality of Planadas, Tolima. 1,800 hectares returned to shade-grown coffee between 2020 and 2023, and leaf-chewing elders who had not tasted their own crop since the 1970s once again brewed Café Coca, a blend of roasted beans and toasted coca leaf sold to tourists for $12 a bag, legal, fragrant, and free of alkaloid. The drink tastes of dark chocolate and mountain mist, a sensory reconciliation of two botanical empires that once marched in opposite directions. Beneath the canopy of policy, a deeper renaissance stirs. Across Peru, Quechua and Ashaninka communities, who remember that coca was mama long before it was commodity, have filed 34 legal petitions demanding recognition of ancestral Coca territories under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Their argument is forensic botany. Lake bed pollen cores show continuous coca cultivation for at least 4,200 years, predating the Inca state itself. In 2022, Peru's Constitutional Court ruled that forced eradication inside titled Native Reserves violates indigenous autonomy. The first-time jurisprudence has privileged cultural heritage over narcotics enforcement. The precedent ripples. Bolivia's government now issues blockchain-verified certificates guaranteeing that exported coca leaf is defumigada, never sprayed with glyphosate, and grown under shade that preserves 30% native biodiversity. European fair trade cooperatives pay a 20% premium for such leaf, destined for energy drinks, herbal teas, and even biodegradable plastics whose polymer chains incorporate coca cellulose. After 5 centuries of criminalization, the plant is attempting a reputational return to its pre-conquest identity, sacred, sustainable, and indigenous. The numbers, however, remain merciless. Global cocaine seizures hit a record 2,100 tons in 2023, equivalent to the entire weight of a U.S. Navy destroyer. Yet the United Nations estimates this intercepts only 20% of production. The street price in Frankfurt has fallen to €55 a gram, cheaper than a bottle of decent Riesling. Purity averages 71%, the highest since the 1970s pharmaceutical era, meaning the white molecule has never been more accessible or more potent. Simultaneously, the carbon footprint of a single gram of cocaine, from cleared cloud forest, to diesel generator, to clandestine flight, to European nightclub, averages 390 grams of CO2, double that of a beefsteak. An entire generation of climate-conscious clubbers now faces the moral paradox of railing a line that contributes more to global warming per minute of high than driving an SUV to the disco. NGOs marketing carbon-neutral cocaine have appeared in Amsterdam and Berlin, promising offsets via reforestation donations in Putumayo, a darkly comic inversion where the empire sells indulgences for its own sins. In the labs, the final reckoning approaches synthesis. The same bioengineered yeast strain that produces cocaine base has been further modified to secrete ecgonine methyl ester directly into the fermentation broth, eliminating the need for leaf entirely. A 500-liter bioreactor operating for 1 week yields the equivalent of 1 hectare of coca bushes, with 90% less water and 0 deforestation. Early investors include a Singapore-based venture fund whose prospectus predicts a $15 billion market for cellular cocaine by 2035, aimed initially at pharmaceutical anesthesia and, upon regulatory relaxation, at recreational sectors. The prospect splits the underworld, traditional traffickers, whose power rests on territorial control of leaf, denounce synthetic betrayal and have placed million-dollar bounties on yeast biochemists. Meanwhile, a younger cadre of crypto-libertarian dealers welcomes the shift, hosting Telegram channels where fermentation protocols are traded like 1990s MP3 files. One post reads, "Leaf is legacy. DNA is destiny." Beneath the bravado lies a vertiginous possibility. If cocaine becomes a data file, then prohibition becomes unenforceable, and the 8,000-year saga of coca, from Andean ritual to global empire, dissolves into a string of ACK code printable anywhere, anytime, by anyone who downloads the torrent. And yet, on a hillside above the Epidemic River where the sun still strikes the ridge like a bronze gong, an old woman named Doña Aurelaya Mamani, whose cheek has held Coca since she could walk, plants the newest hybrid bush bred for drought tolerance. She speaks to it in Aymara, calling it CHMMP, the one who withstands, and when asked about yeast labs and carbon footprints she laughs, revealing emerald gums. The leaf has watched glaciers come and go, she says. It will watch your code as well. Around her, seedlings push through volcanic soil, roots probing for water that may never again fall in sufficient quantity, alkaloid rising in slow milligrams against a sky thick with carbon. Whether empire ends in bioreactor vats or judicial rulings, climate refugees or blockchain ledgers, the plant that began this chronicle remains anchored to the same equation: sunlight, altitude, and human hunger. The final audit is not yet written. The last green frontier is still alive, breathing between cheek and teeth, waiting to see which empire of machines, of molecules, or of mountains will claim the next 1,000 years. The helicopters have gone quiet. After 23 years of rotor blade thunder above the Putumayo canopy, the final U.S. Air Force Black Hawk lifted off from Larandia Base at dawn on 3 August 2025, its shadow gliding over coca bushes already head high, their leaves flickering like green coins in downdraft. The pilots banked north toward Panama, mission flags folded, glyphosate tanks rinsed clean, leaving behind a valley where the silence felt almost archaeological, as if the sound itself had been a civilization that rose, ruled, and vanished into ear-ringing absence. Beneath the vacated sky, a teenage boy named Jefferson Eneko emerged from a bamboo lab, clutching a plastic jar no larger than a spice shaker. Inside lay 200 grams of crystalline powder, 92% pure, refined not in jungle reactors, but in a suitcase-sized centrifuge powered by a car battery and a solar panel the size of a pizza box. He pressed the lid shut, whispered a prayer to the Virgin glued inside the lid, and began the 2-day walk to the river where a fiberglass canoe waited. The empire that once needed fleets of 727s now moved inside a teenager's backpack, its capital reduced to a vessel smaller than the first Inca quid of leaves. At the same moment, 4,200 miles north, a biomedical startup in Cambridge, Massachusetts, printed the final base pair of a yeast plasmid containing the entire 36 kilobase cocaine synthase cluster. The lead researcher, a Peruvian-American postdoc whose grandmother still chews coca during potato planting, saved the file as erythroxylum final v3.7 GB and uploaded it to a cloud server whose IP address floats somewhere above the Atlantic, accessible to anyone with the password and a 3D printed bioreactor. The cost of synthesis has fallen below $500 per kilo of pure product. The cost of prohibition remains $50 billion annually. The ratio is unsustainable, and every policy analyst knows it, yet legislatures hesitate to repeal a century of statutes because the symbolism of the leaf, once sacred, then criminal, now data, has become more powerful than the molecule itself. Thus the empire ends not with surrender, but with diffusion, like smoke losing its shape in cathedral air. In Vienna, the United Nations Commission on Narcotic Drugs meets beneath a mural depicting a phoenix rising from poppy petals. On the agenda is a proposal by Bolivia, Peru, and, astonishingly, Colombia to remove coca leaf from Schedule I of the 1961 Single Convention, arguing that traditional use constitutes cultural patrimony analogous to wine in France or kava in Vanuatu. The vote is scheduled for December 2026, and whips count delegates the way cartels once counted kilos. If successful, the reclassification would legalize international trade in decarcanized leaf for food, cosmetics, and biodegradable plastics, opening a market estimated at $2.4 billion annually, larger than Bolivia's natural gas exports. Indigenous delegations arrive wearing ceremonial awayas woven with Coca green thread. They carry plastic bags of dried leaf and place them on the desk of the Secretary General, like offerings to a conquistador who never quite left. Whether diplomacy or dollars prevail, the symbolism is unmistakable. The plant that financed empires now petitions for diplomatic recognition, a reversal no conquistador could have imagined. Yet recognition arrives in forms more intimate than treaties. In the morgue of Dayton, Ohio, a forensic anthropologist catalogues the 47th cocaine-related overdose of the month, tracing nasal septum erosion with a latex-gloved finger. The victim, a 23-year-old waitress, carried a grocery receipt in her pocket, milk, cereal, a single red rose. On the metal tray beside her lies a half-gram vial labeled Red Scorpion, 90% pure, tested post-mortem at 12% fentanyl by weight. The investigator photographs the scene, uploads the data to the National Forensic Laboratory Information System, and in doing so adds another node to a cloud map that tracks the molecular diaspora from Andean Ridge to Midwestern Vein. Each data point is a votive candle in the cathedral of analytics, flickering proof that empires never truly vanish. They merely translate themselves into smaller and smaller alphabets. First conquest, then chemistry, now code, until the final unit is a single human heart that beats once more and stops. In the highlands, Doña Aurelia Mamani, whose real name has appeared in every chapter of this chronicle, buries her husband beneath a coca bush whose roots twist around pre-Columbian pottery shards. The funeral is Catholic and Aymara simultaneously. Priest sprinkles holy water, shaman scatters coca leaves to the four winds, and both agree the soul will need green currency for the journey. After the mourners descend, she remains alone, chewing slowly, counting the decades in her mouth. The 1950s when soldiers torched her father's field, the 1980s when her sons backpacked paced to the river, the 2020s when drones seeded terraces she no longer had strength to climb. She spits the exhausted quid onto the grave and plants a fresh seedling above it, a gesture at once burial and resurrection. The act contains the entire epic in miniature. Leaf becomes saliva, saliva becomes earth, earth becomes leaf again, and our Ouroboros older than any law, molecule, or blockchain. What, then, is the legacy? Look anywhere and it glints. It is the $50 billion wall that divides Tijuana from San Diego. Its steel posts, sawed apart nightly by battery-powered reciprocating saws. The gaps welded each dawn, a mechanical breathing that costs $1 million per mile per year and stops not 1 gram. It is the glass towers of Miami built on laundered cash, now retrofitted as art galleries, where millennials snort lines off Basquiat plinths, unaware the same powder financed the painting's original auction. It is the 2.3 million Americans who wake up each morning with cocaine metabolites threading their bloodstream, the 1.4 million Latin Americans who still chew coca to endure altitude and hunger, the 390,000 Africans who now smoke crack in tin-roofed shebeens where kerosene lamps flicker like 1980s Detroit. It is the yeast plasmid sitting in a cloud folder named Erythroxylum Final V 3.7. GB, waiting for the click that will download it into a future no prophecy can chart. And it is this, a single leaf, plucked at dawn by Jefferson and Echo, as mist lifts off the Epidemic, tucked into his cheek for the long walk to a river that carries all empires downstream. He does not know whether his jar will be seized, shot into a vein in Rotterdam, or brewed next year by a bioreactor in a Reykjavik basement. He knows only that the bush keeps growing, the alkaloid keeps rising, and the sun keeps striking the ridge like a bronze gong. Between cheek and gum, past and future collapse into a green present that tastes of bitterness and endurance, an aftertaste shared by Inca porters, Spanish muleteers, Miami stockbrokers, and Midwestern waitresses alike. The empire ends here, in the mouth of a boy who has never heard of Albert Niemann, Sigmund Freud, or Albert Hoffman, yet whose blood will carry the same molecule that once raced through theirs. He swallows, spits, and walks on. The leaf remains. The story does not conclude, it merely waits to be chewed again.